The president released his fiscal year 2013 budget. Concord has called it a Rorschach test for analysts of all stripes, because we can see good things, we can see bad things. There's stuff to criticize, there's stuff to be hopeful for. How do you see it, Diane?
Well, I think there's not a lot new in it this year, but as we've said in the past, we see a disappointing lack of proposals for fundamental reform to Social Security and Medicare, the biggest drivers of our spending increases going forward, and not much in the way of tax reform in terms of significant increases in revenue that will be needed to keep up with rising health costs. But we do see some progress in terms of the president reiterating his commitment to honor spending caps and to follow through with health care reform cost controls. And also the sentiment that there's plenty of room to reform the tax system in ways that would raise tax burdens primarily for high-income households, but also in a way that broadens the tax base and makes taxes more efficient.
Yeah, I think one of the things people maybe don't appreciate so much about the president's budget is that it's really just a statement of presidential wishes. It has no force of law. Congress creates their own spending and revenue estimates, and then spending legislation, and sometimes revenue legislation, sometimes not. And so the president's budget really isn't exactly the budget for the United States. It's just his outline. And one of the tough things is that it's a 10-year outline. So these fundamental reforms that we would prefer to see, that Congress and the president have not been able to get together on for now 3 years, really, it's hard to make them in a president's budget because the president's budget only goes out 10 years. But if you don't see them, it's kind of like, what's the point of any of these things? Because they're all piecemeal, they're all incremental, they won't get enacted. So really, a preferable thing to see would be the blueprint for how do we get that long-term change, and that doesn't come in these budgets most often.
And we're in an election year, so
right.
I think it's even less likely that we get that nice long-term outlook that we always hope for. This year, being an election year, a lot of people accuse the budget of being a very political document. I think we do see some new proposals in this budget that sound nice to voters, probably, because they're new tax cut initiatives, new spending initiatives that seem to promote goals that Americans are concerned about right now. There are a lot of education provisions, a lot of manufacturing sector provisions, and they all cost money, but very little emphasis on the proposals that actually save money or raise revenue. So I think that's to be expected given the election year. Given that, I think the budget maybe exceeded some of our expectations, given that there are some proposals that do raise money or reduce the deficit.
One of the confusing things, I think, for people that look at a president's budget is there's all this focus on the bottom line number. How much does it save? And how much is each proposal? And those are normally given in dollar figures. But as we've seen in this budget and most budgets, the amount of savings really just depends on your starting point.
Right.
And the president and the administration often create their own starting point and then measure off that. And that makes it very confusing for the media and analysts and the American public to figure out what exactly is going on. And I think our point is always, it doesn't really matter what number, whether it's 4 trillion as the president and the administration say, or 1 trillion or 6 trillion. What matters is where you wind up at spending and tax levels. And this budget, I think, falls a little bit short relative to like the Bull-Simpson Commission.
We end up at a point where deficits as a share of GDP are kind of teetering at the edge of sustainability. And so it's not quite what we would achieve, for example, under current law. If we just let current law play out, CBO has shown us recently that you can get the deficit down to a much lower level than what would occur under the president's budget as he's just proposed. One thing the budget does emphasize or bring out in the big picture story is that there's a need for us to start really looking at the big categories of spending and the revenue side of our budget. That discretionary spending is a relatively small portion of the budget, and we've been squeezing it pretty well, pretty successfully already. Scheduled spending cuts and caps are going to take effect, and they're assumed in the president's budget. But so the president comes up with some proposals to reduce mandatory spending and some proposals, pretty good proposals to raise revenue.
Yeah, I think that's the real key, and I think if you look at anything Congress and the president are going to face over the next year before the election, it's a lot of pressure on what to do about the triggered sequestration cuts to discretionary spending that are going to happen because the super committee failed to act, and those are going to hit right at the beginning of 2013. And so the president does a good thing by saying he's sticking to that level of deficit reduction. He has some new proposals for how to get that level of deficit reduction that doesn't come just from discretionary spending, which already is scheduled to be a lower part of GDP than really at any time since World War II. And he outlines some savings in Medicare, some savings in Medicaid, and certainly the tax proposals that'll raise some revenue, and saying that really it can't just be about discretionary spending going forward. We made almost a little over $2 trillion worth of progress on deficits just cutting discretionary spending, and now it's time to look at the rest of spending. So that's one of those positive things we can take from this budget.
So, I mean, would you say that this budget is sort of fleshing out some of the details that would be consistent with what the president had recommended to the super committee?
Yeah,
the balanced framework?
Yeah, I think most people think this is basically taking the president's proposal to the super committee and putting it in budget form with a few tweaks here and there, a few new proposals, and so it's really just a question of how and when are we going to get Congress to go along with it, or the president to go along with some plan Congress has to do similar deficit reduction over the long term that incorporates all the areas of the government.
Right. Good.